Joe Biden, on his way out as president of the United States, seems to be, at least his administration does, on kind of a bait and switch. On the one hand, they're telling us that they're continuing to help Ukraine, quote, defend itself. They're also claiming that they're trying to help them get to a stronger negotiating position while taking actions which probably work to the exact opposite of that. And they'll just use all kinds of 1984-ish language that says one thing and does another. And this could have significant ramifications, not just for the really the hapless people of Ukraine that we allege to want to support, but even potentially for the United States and our own national security if this thing gets out of hand in the next about 48 days. To try to make some sense out of all this and at least tell you what's really going on, we have back in the show today Colonel Doug Macgregor, highly decorated combat veteran and CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, and former Trump administration official toward the end of his last administration. Colonel, welcome back to the show.
Happy to be here, Dan.
Well, listen, it's one of these days we're going to get you on and just talk about something, positive and uplifting, if anything like that can be found. But
you need to come visit us in Orlando at Disney World, and you'll be much happier.
Oh, you know what? I think that we might do a live show maybe from there. How about that? That could work. That would be fun. But we still got to call things for what they are, and if nothing else, truth can get through and at least help people understand what's actually really going on, despite some of the words that are used. I want to actually start in NATO today because earlier today, new Secretary General Mark Rutte was first of all talking to the press before he went in to finish a ministerial conference that they've been having with foreign ministers down there, where they were, of course, one of the primary things they're talking about is Ukraine. Before the last meeting, he went on to talk about some of the needs of the Ukraine and what they're doing about it.
We discussed what we can do collectively to make sure that, one, Ukraine has the air defense it needs, also to protect its critical infrastructure and energy infrastructure. And secondly, how to make sure that Ukraine will get to a position of strength so that then Ukraine can start talks about its future in the region.
Okay, let's just start off right there, because he's just making this categorical claim. And if anybody has not been paying attention, they just listen. I mean, he's the Secretary General. He sounds impressive. There's 100 microphones in his face, so he must be important. He must know what he's talking about. And he's actually talking about like it's real, that, hey, we just need to strengthen them a little bit so that they can get this. And by the way, we'll give them a little bit of air defense so that they can protect their critical infrastructure, which they haven't done in 2 years. So with that seemingly dramatic disconnection from reality, what do you make of his comments?
Well, as you rightly point out, it doesn't make any difference what we give Ukraine at this stage. Most of the critical energy infrastructure is being destroyed or disabled. NATO itself can protect at most 5% of its landmass from air and missile attack, which amounts to almost nothing. Keep in mind that Secretary of State Blinken has just announced within the last 24 hours that $50 billion in Russian assets will be transferred to Ukraine. So this is a theft on a public level, on a gargantuan scale of money that is not ours, it belongs to Russia. This obviously is to cultivate goodwill and improve our position with Russia, no doubt. I'm surprised that the Russians will listen to anything we say and talk to anybody we send over there. So that's the first disaster. The U.S. Army, I found out this morning, Department of the Army is being told to transfer roughly $5 billion in equipment and ammunition by the 5th of January to Ukraine. So this train that is supposed to sustain Ukraine until 20 January or potentially beyond that is running at full speed. The question is there anybody at the other end of the line to accept any of this and do anything with it? About the only thing I think we can be certain of is that half of the money will be stolen and end up in foreign banks in places like Cyprus, Albania, Singapore, Shanghai, who knows? And that's about it. Now, how much of the equipment will get there? We think now a third to a half of the equipment we've sent over there has ended up on the black market too. So in other words, the organized crime state called Ukraine is going to be propped up until the last possible moment. The real question is not so much why that's being done. Obviously, it's being done because the outgoing regime does not want to admit to the public, nor do its European allies want to admit to its electorates that this has been a massive scam, a scandal. It's never had any chance of success. It's failed miserably. What will the Russians do in response? I imagine they'll pick out most of these targets where they find great quantities of equipment and people and destroy them, which is what they've been doing over the last few days. I'm sure you're aware they've struck targets that we think that as many as 40 or 50 so-called NATO officers have been killed as a result of these strikes. Of course, no one will admit to the truth and tell us who they are, because that might cause an eruption of discontent at home in Europe. Dan, what can we say at this point? The war is lost. It was lost a long time ago. Nothing that we are doing today is going to change that outcome. But they're going to continue to waste time, money, and resources as long as they're in power. And again, the real question is, what does President Trump do? And as I've said many, many times, the first thing he should do is suspend all aid to Ukraine immediately. Stop wasting time, money, and assets on this criminal regime, and then withdraw all U.S. personnel, uniformed or otherwise, whether it's military, diplomatic, or intelligence, get them out of Ukraine as quickly as possible. That will bring an immediate end to the war, because at that point, the edifice that we call Ukraine, or I should say the facade, will collapse. And the Russians will then begin putting whatever is left together. I imagine a new regime of some kind will emerge. But the point is, we're not prepared to do that. We're interested in preserving this puppet regime. We don't care how many people in Ukraine are killed or wounded or die. We just want this to go on the mistaken belief that somehow or another this helps us and harms Russia. Well, if it's harmed Russia, Russia looks awfully strong and powerful to me, and we look increasingly weak and confused.
So let me ask you something, Doug, on this point. Zelensky, in an interview with Sky News about 4 or 5 days ago, said that, hey, one of the big problems is that this big surge of equipment could help. He said that we had 10 brigades and we need them outfitted, but I've only got 2.5 brigades worth of kit. So I've got 7.5 brigades that are sitting here, waiting for stuff, implying that, and apparently the U.S. is facilitating this belief that if we just get them all this stuff, then all of a sudden then they can be a really effective military force. But in many of the books that you've written, you talk about how it takes years to build a force. So I wonder if you can talk about what you think the utility, let's say that they got all 10 brigades outfitted, shortly after the 6th of January, what difference would that make on the battlefield?
Well, given the paucity of veterans, they're not likely to perform very well. This is reminiscent of what happened towards the end of the Second World War in Germany. Most of the veterans were dead. Remember, by October of 1943, the Germans had lost 55,000 officers. I don't think any other army in the world could have continued fighting all the way until May of 1945, but the German army, because of the high quality of its leadership. But this army is by no means the Wehrmacht. They've already run out of the lifeblood of their country. They're now dragging in 18-year-olds. You and I have seen all the videos that are posted on Telegram and elsewhere of boys being dragged into uniform. It's a complete waste of time. We make this mistake in the United States. We say, well, we need more men in the Army or more men in the Marine Corps. Well, you can add more personnel, but that doesn't necessarily equate to trained, organized, equipped, and effective formations. And armies consist of formations, not individuals. So you're 100% right. So I imagine there'll be some veterans in these formations, but probably not enough to make any difference. But again, that doesn't matter. Remember, that's not the point. The point is to keep this orgy of death and destruction going as long as possible. And it's a waste of time, because most of these governments in Europe that are supporting this craziness are going to be out of business anyway. Schultz is going to be tossed out. Now, I don't know who will replace him. I've understood that some man named Merz may come in, and he's as much on the lunatic fringe as Scholz is, refuses to come to terms with reality. I don't know what will happen with France. Le Pen is probably more reasonable and rational. Starmer is waiting to be removed from office, I think, by open rebellion in England. We'll see. You know, this is a catastrophe. NATO is on the ropes. The European Union is going to crumble. None of this is going to work. The only thing that has happened as a result of this war is Europe is convulsing in disorder, and we are confused and wasting money, resources, and assets while the important problems that we have to solve here at home are ignored.
And I want to go down that path a little bit more, because one of the claims from the United States and NATO in getting this additional ammunition and weapons surged into Ukraine is so that it gives them enough strength in order to have a good negotiating position. But concurrent with that, then after this ministerial meeting this morning, just a couple of hours ago, you had Mark Rutte saying, here's what the strategic objective is.
Well, let's not forget that in 2008, already in Bucharest, there was the decision that the future of Ukraine should be in NATO. And we have had the decision in Washington on the irreversible path towards NATO. And basically, since early 2022, countries have been working on bilateral agreements with Ukraine to make sure that we do everything to get them in a position of strength. We have the pledge, we have the command in Wiesbaden, and all of this is building the bridge towards NATO.
Building a bridge to NATO. The very reason that Russia went to war, you're trying to tell everybody that part of the negotiated deal is Ukraine with the bridge to NATO. What does that tell you?
You know, when Ambassador McFarland took over under the Obama administration as ambassador in Russia, one of the first things in his discussions with the Russians, he was told by Putin personally. Putin leaned over and whispered and said, "You don't listen." Well, this is a perfect example of nobody is listening. We've had Stoltenberg, who represents 5 million Norwegians. I've forgotten how many people live in the Netherlands right now. Is it 7 million, 8 million? These are both willing puppets of the globalist elites that rule us in Washington and in Europe. These people don't represent anything. They don't represent any major military capability. They are, in fundamental terms, a joke. And he's standing up there making outrageous statements that have been fed to him from Washington, once again, to maintain the facade. All of this rests on the foundation that is really made of paper. It's bloviation. It's hot air. We don't have anything more to send over there ourselves. We're entirely dependent upon air and naval power to try and compensate for the very small and inadequate ground forces that we have. All of this is bluster and nonsense. They think the Russians are buffaloed. The Russians are not buffaloed. The Russians know the score. And eventually, if we continue down this road, they will advance and we will be subject to missile attack. And we will see installations inside NATO destroyed. And if you think that the NATO states are going to collectively come together and scream bloody murder for nuclear war with Russia, well, you're very much mistaken. The populations in Europe are not interested in going to war with Russia. So all of this is hot air. It doesn't make any sense. And they can't forcibly drag people into war with Russia who don't want to go, no matter how hard they may try.
And there are some that seem to really do want to try that. And I listen, it's hard for me to understand what the even perceived benefit would be to this. But you said a lot of this is coming from Washington. A lot of it is also coming from London. And you have now disgraced former Prime Minister Boris Johnson was on a radio show a couple of days ago talking about what he thinks ought to be part of a negotiated settlement in addition to NATO being on the table.
I don't think he can begin by vitiating that, by risking a capitulation to Putin and the humiliation of the United States, because that's what, and of NATO, because that's effectively what it would be if he were to pull the plug on the Ukrainians. So I think we should certainly be putting troops in to backfill. Absolutely.
British troops.
Yeah, I think in the areas, I don't think we should be sending in combat troops to take on the Russians, but I think as part of the solution, as part of the end state, you're going to want to have multinational European peacekeeping forces monitoring the border, but also helping the Ukrainians. And I cannot see that such a European operation could possibly happen without the British. We've got to be there.
Now, a couple of days after this, I'm not making this up, Michael Clark went on Sky News and said that he thinks French, UK, and German troops should neutral European states should be patrolling this, looking across the line of contact, daring Russia to attack. What in the world are they talking about?
It reminds me of a discussion Napoleon held with his marshals about advancing somewhere in Europe. And somebody raised the point, sire, the Pope opposes this idea. The Pope won't support it. Napoleon looked at the man and said, how many battalions has the Pope got? The answer was none. What kind of force is this man talking about? 70,000 men in the British Army? Oh, he's going to mobilize the so-called territorials. Our National Guard is going to be mobilized and a few weeks later launch into an offensive against the Russians. I mean, that's essentially what he's talking about. It's absurd. In 1914, the British had a more capable force probably than they had at almost any time in their history to that point in terms of an army. And they sent it to the continent in 1914, even though that force had never been designed to fight on the continent. It was designed to go elsewhere. But the point is they sent it. And 90 days later, most of that force of over 150,000 men was annihilated, almost non-existent, crushed. And they began shoving volunteers in to fill the levee. At the end of the whole process, 80% of the defensive line facing the Germans was manned by French troops. Only 20% was manned by the British. And that did not change for several years because the British simply didn't have the manpower trained, organized, and equipped to do anything. This is even worse. I mean, the 70,000-man British Army is a boutique force. I mean, certainly they do a brilliant job of performing in London and at the Edinburgh Tattoo, and they'll do a great job suppressing people in Sierra Leone or in far-off British Guiana. But this is not a force designed to fight the Russians. Neither is the French force. A friend of mine in the French army says the only thing the French army is prepared to do, Douglas, is go on safari in North Africa. And that's all by design because people many, many years ago decided that we weren't going to fight any wars in Europe. And in fact, NATO's purpose all through the 90s, whenever I would ask about it, would be the same thing. NATO is here to prevent any more wars from breaking out in Europe. Well, we discovered that was wrong. NATO exists to fight wherever the United States wants to send it. And NATO exists to support whatever belligerent actions the United States wants to take. This is ridiculous. It has no chance of success. It's going nowhere. And if those forces cross into Western Ukraine, they'll end up coming back in body bags because the Russians are ready and the Russians can mobilize more forces. They are at a war standing right now. They're ready to fight. Now, they don't want to. They'd rather end this thing and get back to business as usual, and they'd much rather do business with the British and the French and the Germans. This is all concocted, fictitious nonsense. And somehow or another, the people in Europe have got to rise up and put a stop to it before their governments commit suicide.
Now, I think that what a lot of people in Europe are waiting on to see what happens with the incoming Trump administration. And of course, he's, campaigned all about wanting to end the war on the first day and all this kind of stuff. Well, since he has won the election and now his administration is starting to take shape, a lot of the focus has been on his special envoy to Ukraine, General Kellogg, who used to be the national security advisor for the vice president under Trump's first campaign. And he was on news, Fox News a couple of days ago, answered a question that, hey, is the Trump administration upset because Biden has allowed long-range weapons and is now flooding the zone with all of this additional equipment and everything that that Jake Sullivan's talking about, et cetera. And instead of saying he was upset about it, he had a different take that it actually gives Trump leverage.
In a way, it's really pretty good for the president-elect because it gives him leverage. He can make the decision on what he wants to do, and the more that the Biden administration does this, it creates a greater opportunity for the president-elect to do what he wants to do. And again, he understands leverage probably better than anybody based on his business experience. But, we go back to September when Zelensky came to Trump Tower, and he went up there, and then he and the president spoke, and they were talking about after 1,000 days of war, they're signaling it's time for this war to end. Because the president said very clearly, and it's a quote, it is time. And he's right about that. This war's gone on for over 1,000 days. It's expanded. It's now global in nature. When I mean global in nature, when you look at what's happened, you've got the North Koreans involved by providing troops, you've got the Iranians involved, you've got the Chinese involved, and you've got the Russians involved. So the makeup of the war has expanded, and it's time we kind of put it back in a box, not only for American security, but for global security as well. Yeah. So I don't have a problem with what they've done. It's all based on leverage. The president understands that, and he's going to use it to his advantage.
What troubles me about this, I think he might believe what he's saying, that he thinks that he does have leverage, and he just articulated accurately. You've got Russia that you just pointed out is much stronger than it was in February 2022. It's 500,000 larger than it was, and their defense industrial base, the armament, all kinds of things are much better than they were before. And they have now military agreements with both North Korea and Iran to provide missiles, drones, et cetera. So there's a big thinking but somehow General Kellogg says, well, we'll just use the leverage of this $8 billion we're trying to punch out at the last minute. And somehow that's going to put them back in a box. And I think that box doesn't have any walls, Doug.
I think we have to look at the assumptions that underpin his statements. Listen carefully. His assumption is that Russia's on the ropes. He's like all the other fools in Washington that want to believe that Russia has taken terrible casualties, that it has a manpower shortage, that it can't cope, that its society is divided, that the Russian people are discontented. I mean, these are the things that pass for informed opinion in Washington, D.C. That's all nonsense. It's just crap. But that's what's informing him. So he thinks, well, that's fine. The Russians are being hammered with long-range strike weapons, so they'll be ready to do a deal with us when we show up. He's crazy. All this does is reaffirm in Russian minds that we're out of touch with reality, that we are deeply in denial. And so what you're going to see, I think, is something akin to what you saw with the Oreshnik missile strike recently, only much worse. And then you get these stupid remarks from people, well, if the Russians use nuclear weapons, that'll be the end of them. No one's going to use nuclear weapons. The Russians certainly won't. If anybody did, I'm afraid it would probably be us in a moment of desperation. It's just crazy. And this statement, 300 reserves, no doubt that that's true. But let's get back to the other statement. There are no North Koreans fighting in Ukraine. This is absolute bullshit. It's never been true. He doesn't need any North Koreans to fight there. Interestingly enough, when the president of Korea, who launched this putsch to try and make himself dictator of South Korea in perpetuity, one of the things that he kept harping on was, we need to send South Korean troops to Ukraine to fight with NATO. Well, that went over like a lead balloon with the Korean people. They said, first of all, we don't believe there are any North Koreans in Ukraine. People actually had this common sense to say, we don't believe it. Secondly, we're not going there. We're not fighting outside of Asia. We're not fighting outside of Korea. We're not going to do it. Now, his attempt failed miserably. His attempt at martial law was crushed by the parliament. He's finished. He's going to be impeached and probably will go to prison. And he's a lackey for the United States. He's a puppet. He's exactly the kind of puppet that we like, just like Rutte, just like Stoltenberg, like Sisi in Egypt, and like Abdullah, sadly, in Jordan. They would like to get rid of Assad in Syria and put another puppet there. This is part of the larger larger strategic approach. It's failing miserably. I think Americans have got to step back and say, when are we going to be told the truth? And the only way that's going to happen is that if Donald Trump comes in as president of the United States, I hope he's doing it now, but I have my doubts, and demands the truth. What is the truth? Stop telling me all the crap that comes over the mainstream media, because most of the people I know don't believe it. That's what you should tell them. Now, tell me what the truth is. Tell me what the real losses are, because you'd think Ukraine was winning after losing over 600,000 dead on the battlefield to the Russians. And that's a conservative estimate now. I remember when people thought that was high, but now people are privately telling me that's conservative. We don't know how bad it is, but we know that Ukraine is a dying nation. So when is President Trump going to say, I want the truth? Don't come in here and try to BS me. Now, let me stop for a second. This is not the first time these kinds of things have happened. When Richard Nixon decided that he wanted to begin the strategic arms limitation talks with the Russians, he turned to Kissinger and said, we've got to know the truth. And Kissinger said, what do you mean? He said, what you and I must know what the Soviets really do have and what they don't have and what their capabilities are. He said, this stuff that comes over from the CIA is just outrageous. It's all inflated. It can't all be true. And Kissinger said, you're right. And he made the decision to bring the station chiefs from the Central Intelligence Agency in Eastern Europe and other locations around the world that shared a border with or some sort of interest with Russia to come to Washington and brief him in person on what the ground truth was about the Soviet missile capability, its warheads, its nuclear program, and so forth. And when they came out of that room from briefing Kissinger, Kissinger had in his hand something that was radically different from what the CIA in Washington had presented to the president. Very different. They went on to start the strategic arms limitations talks, and those talks were successful, just like the intermediate nuclear force talks were successful. We had successful arms control arrangements in action. Now, they weren't all perfect, and there were violations from time to time, including by us. And you always have to make the decision, is the violation egregious enough or dangerous enough that I need to let my opponent know that I know what he does? And most of the time, the answer to that is no. We had these in place. The Trump administration stripped the rest of them out. We're now sitting here with nothing. And then everyone is surprised when an Oreshnik missile that flies at who knows what, Mach 8, Mach 9, Mach 10, 9 times or 10 times the speed of sound, and delivers 36 precision-guided bomblets or rockets, and signals that this destructive capability is equal to a small nuclear warhead, at least 5 kiloton blast. And the big message is, we don't need nuclear weapons. We can reach our targets without them, and there's nothing you can do to stop them. And in the meantime, we're saying we're going to provide air defense to the Ukrainians when we can't even defend ourselves. These people are delusional. They should be removed immediately from the government.
Speaking of delusional, you mentioned at the outset of this that one of the things that you would recommend that the incoming Trump administration does is immediately stop all the support, because then that's going to lead to the reality that even the fiction can't be sustained any longer. And ironically, Zelensky was asked about this a couple of days ago about what he thinks would happen if that very policy were put into place.
You said the U.S. can't force you to sit at the negotiating table. What if the U.S. government cuts military funding to Ukraine?
If they will cut, I think we will lose. Of course, anyway, we will stay, we will fight. We have our production, but it's not enough to prevail. And I think it's not enough to survive. But that will be, if such choice will be American choice. So we will decide what we will have to do.
But see, I don't think that would be the result, that they are going to lose. They would only lose if he did what he said, which was we would continue to fight on without it. But if Trump comes in and says, hey, we're going to cut all this stuff so that you can seek a negotiated settlement on the best terms you can get, which will be ugly, but will stop the war. I mean, do you see that as his two choices?
I think Zelensky will immediately pack his bags full of cash and gold, climb onto his private jet or into his Bugatti that his wife drives between Kiev and Warsaw, and leave and fly to who knows where. Perhaps he'll fly to his Italian vineyards, this magnificent mansion that he's purchased, or perhaps he flies to Israel, which I know has offered him sanctuary. Of course, if I were he right now, I'm not sure that that's what I would do, given the very volatile situation there. But nevertheless, he'll just leave. He'll leave the place entirely, and then somebody else will step forward. I don't know if that's Zelensky sitting in London now, that I understand that MI6 and others have groomed as a potential replacement. Who knows? But this whole thing is done. It's over. The population has suffered enough. It only gets worse from here. Not only are they going to freeze in the winter, but pretty soon they're going to go hungry. They're not going to eat. They won't have any fuel for their trucks, tractors, anything in Ukraine. So people need to wise up and recognize they're dealing with probably one of the greatest scam artists in the history of mankind, and that's Zelensky. This man is the Bernie Madoff of international relations. He belongs in jail or much worse, just like Bernie Madoff did. And that's what you've got. Bernie Madoff running the show, telling people lie after lie after lie. And he's being encouraged to do that by his friends. And his friends are in power right now in Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris.
Well,
and
yeah, that's what I was going to say.
You can do about it till they're gone.
You're talking about a Bernie Madoff, but without this enabler here, who is ostensibly the Secretary of State of the United States, all this fiction would just be like a television show that he used to do.
Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership, but we're focused on this in a practical way. We set up a dedicated NATO command whose purpose is to help speed Ukraine down that path to membership. And one of the things we focused on here was making sure that that command was fully resourced. And now countries have stepped up to make sure that they have the people in place to make the command operational. That, as a practical matter, along with the reforms that Ukraine continues to engage, is what's going to move it to membership in the alliance. So Ukraine is on a clear trajectory that we've worked to establish and that we want to make sure continues through the end of this year and well into next year. And that way, the Ukrainians will be in a strong position to make the decisions that they need to make about their future. If Russia insists on continuing the aggression, Ukraine will be able to deal with it. If Russia is actually prepared to negotiate in good faith, Ukraine will be able to do it from a stronger position.
So what do you think is at play here, Doug? So that's today. That's earlier today. We're roughly 6 weeks out before he's out of power. Why would you want to say something that I can't imagine that he doesn't know what you've said here already, that there is no capacity. They will never be in NATO. Trump is not even going to entertain the possibility. Are they saying stuff like this to try to make it look like Trump pulled the rug out from under him or something? Or why would they keep saying stuff so detached from reality?
You know, when the French lost the war to the Prussians in 1871, after the war was over, inside the French general staff, they said, "Speak of it never, but think of it always." In other words, don't mention this, don't bring it up. We don't want to talk about it, but never forget it. I think that's what we're dealing with here. We're just flat out denying the truth for the reasons that I outlined. Everyone has stepped forward and joined the big lie. No one can deviate. No one can diverge from the path of lying. If they do, the whole thing collapses immediately. So you keep up the front, you maintain the facade, regardless of what it costs in American money and resources, regardless of how many Ukrainians are killed. And we now know that we've lost people in Ukraine as well, although no one will admit it, along with our NATO allies. And then when the new man takes over, if he does anything at all, that moves us closer to a negotiated settlement that ultimately recognizes the ground truth, which is Russia is in charge. Russia's won this war, and Russia is not going to back down from that. Why would they? I wouldn't. It just, if we had won something, we wouldn't back down from it either. So the bottom line is that's what no one wants to do. And if Donald Trump does it, and I think eventually he'll be compelled to do it, although instead of doing it, I predict what we'll probably see happen is that the media will be told by the CIA and MI6 and everything else, just don't talk about this anymore. Focus elsewhere. And we'll give them a new war in the Middle East. Only the new war in the Middle East will be as bad, if not worse, than what we've seen already in eastern Ukraine. And we are not going to be on the winning side on that one either. But that's preferable to admitting disaster. I mean, don't you remember how Jimmy Carter and, for that matter, Gerald Ford all stood up and said, we failed miserably in Vietnam. It was a tragedy. It was a disaster. We should never have done it. Don't you remember when they made those statements? No, they never made those statements.
Yeah.
They said, oh, we may have killed 250,000 or 300,000 Vietnamese. My God, we killed at least 2 million, I suspect, based on the numbers that I've seen. No one would admit it. Today, we talk about it, but there was never a willingness at the time to be truthful. Disraeli said that the rarest commodity in politics is courage. Boy, was he right. There's no one with courage to admit anything. And the sad part is that for President Trump, this is a simple issue. You simply stand there and you say, look, I didn't start this. I didn't want this, and I want to end it. I'm going to take steps to do that, whatever is required, because this is something we don't want to be part of anymore. And we don't want a war with Russia. Kling, he wins. He wins.
I think a lot of people would support that. I mean,
he wins from Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine. That's a winning hand. Instead of this nonsense, according to Sebastian Gorka, man about town, if you don't do what we say, well, then he'll deliver more aid than he's ever delivered. Yeah, and who's going to pick it up and use it? Is he going to address a room full of dead and skeletons? Talk to the cemeteries, tell them to get up, and here's the equipment you want. And you hear this crap of, it's our fault they're in this position. We should have let them do anything they wanted to begin with. Well, that's a lot of nonsense. It was always a disaster. This was always a no-winner. And the only solution when you have failed in a proxy war is to jump in and fight it yourself. It's the only solution. And you know what, Dan? We're not going to do that. Neither is Mr. Rutte or his predecessor Stoltenberg. Forget it. They're not going to show up.
Yeah, or Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron. When it comes down to it, I don't think that they're going to shovel their own troops into that. I don't think either one of them politically could survive. Not to mention the fact it's immoral. What do you think, Doug? And let's look at a different aspect of this. The Ukrainian people. What is your guess as to when all this plays out? Is it necessarily will? It just has to. The war has long been decided. It just is still be going on to find out what the final loss tally is going to be on the Ukraine side. But once it finally happens, it seems that even the government media campaigns and whatnot that have been flooding the Ukraine zone all the way through about, we're going to win, we're going to drive them back to the 1991 borders, all this stuff, when all of it's exposed as being a sham. What do the people think? Do they feel, or are they going to feel like they've been betrayed by their people, betrayed by the West? Are they going to think that, oh no, you guys just didn't do enough and then we would have won? How do you think that's going to play out on the ground?
My impression from the feedback I get from Ukraine, people on the ground there, is the population is exhausted and wants this to end. And they're quite prepared to cede territory in eastern Ukraine that most of them always knew was Russian anyway. This is the problem. When Brzezinski was still alive in the 1990s, he approached Bill Clinton and he brought up the issue of Ukraine. And he specifically said, Ukraine is a disaster waiting to happen because eastern Ukraine is Russified. And we've got to come to terms with that. If we don't, there will be a war down the line. So we need to redraw the map, rearrange the borders. Well, there was no will to do it in the 1990s. Bill Clinton didn't care about it. And so where are we today? We're exactly where we are, according to what you've got on the screen. We're telling them recruit more people to die for what? And the Ukrainians are saying, no, we don't want it. And I'm sure that's true. Now, having said all of that, and having grown up with people from Western Ukraine, they will never change their minds and their attitudes about the Russians. And the sad part is that they confuse being a Russian with being a communist. This is part of the problem. They're living with the nightmare of the 1920s and 30s, when the Bolsheviks murdered millions of people, millions of Ukrainians, raped them, brutalized them, deported them, and shot them, and starved them to death. That has never gone away. It never would. That's one of the reasons why when the Wehrmacht reached Eastern Europe and moved in, they were greeted almost virtually everywhere, even in White Russia and even by many Russians, as a liberating force. That was a missed opportunity. That could have been the end of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, would have saved everybody a great deal of grief. Unfortunately, the people at the top, Adolf Hitler in particular, wouldn't adapt to reality. So the problem is that more lives were lost, at least 39 million, contrary to what the Russians say. And here we sit. We're dealing with the legacy of this nightmare, this tragedy. They need to come to terms with the reality that is, in fact, over. And they've got to live in a new world now. And that new world doesn't have to bear any resemblance to that horror that they experienced in the past. Now, how do we do that? I don't know, but it doesn't matter when the borders are drawn. And, the simple truth is, if you go back and look through the maps through hundreds of years, you go to the top of the map where the border of Ukraine meets Belarus, and you follow the Dnieper River south. Just follow that line south, okay? Eventually, what you get is a line that goes all the way down to where Crimea is. And that line for that river has historically been, for most of the last 1,000 years, the border of the West. Everything to the east was Russian, Mongolian, Tartar, and Turkic. Everything to the west was considered European. Maybe not Central European, but European. And here we are. What is the line that we're drawing? The Russians are only drawing a line along those areas that were part of what was called Novorossiya under Catherine the Great. When Catherine the Great sent her armies down there to throw the Tartars and the Mongols out, there were very few people living there. If you go to Mariupol was founded in about 1805 or 1807. And as I recollect, they were founded by Germans or Englishmen that had been brought in to start these cities by the Tsarina. And then they began gathering Eastern Slavs, either from Ukraine or Russia, in to populate, because those areas hadn't been developed. The Ottomans never did anything with it. And so what you get today is this sort of crazy notion that Ukraine is this nation state that has withstood all sorts of problems for 1,000 years. It's not true. It's a region. It's an area. And the people that live there are not the same today as they were 800 years ago or even 300 years ago, thanks to tragedy after tragedy. We don't understand all of this. We don't have the answers to it, which is why we have no business being involved in it.
Right. Yeah. And the people who live there have a hard enough time it is, but all we can do is just exacerbate it. Well, we'll have to hope that when President Trump gets in, that he'll do any version of the things that you recommend, because that certainly would be the best way to put a cap on something really ugly and prevent it from getting any further. Before I let you go, though, I want to bring back something you mentioned earlier in the show, and that's this situation in South Korea. With the current president, having this dramatic moment where he said, I'm going to sign martial law at like 11 p.m. on a certain night, and thinking he's going to send some troops to bar the door from the legislature, but they beat him to it, and then they voted and legally undid the thing before really even the sun had hardly come up the next day. Now, a lot of people are just saying this is a big embarrassment to him, et cetera, but you think it's much more than that.
President Yoon is the head of the Party of People's Power. I think they call it the People's Power Party. Before that, it was the Grand National Party. It had other names, but it's effectively the party that has always aligned itself with Washington. And the people at the top of it were effectively cronies of American imperialism. In other words, they represented the interests of Washington first and foremost, and the interests of the people living on the peninsula, secondly, on the assumption that those two interests were identical. You always get that, and they never are. In 1997, in Breaking the Phalanx, I wrote a section in there urging for the future that the four-star who commands forces on the Korean Peninsula should be a Korean. He's always been an American four-star ever since the Korean War. And we command today all the forces, Korean and American, that are on that peninsula. We have about 27,000, 26,000 people on the peninsula. The Koreans, of course, have hundreds of thousands of troops and aircraft and so forth. We should be out of there. We're not really required to be there any longer. And the population in North Korea has dropped from 27, 28, 29 million down to 23 or 22 million through mass starvation, mass murder, whatever. That particular regime has been circling the drain economically and in human terms for years. But the rub has always been that we are there. And the assumption was that our nuclear umbrella would act as the ultimate secure network for Korea. Yoon came in a few years ago and followed a liberal nationalist government. And that government was pressing for its own independence and sovereignty to become a fully sovereign state. And the president at the time, President Moon, said, how can I show myself in public and meet with the president of China, meet with the prime minister of Japan, meet with the president of Malaysia, the leader of Vietnam? How do I do that when everybody knows I don't command Korea's armed forces? Our armed forces are under the command of Washington. We are not a truly sovereign state. And he was voted out of office by a razor-thin margin. And at the time President Moon was voted out, or his party was voted out of power, and his successor lost, there was a lot of discussion in Korea just beneath the surface about CIA meddling in the Korean election. Because the Korean intelligence services, and in fact much of its military, are appendages of U.S. intelligence and U.S. military power. And so the generals and the leaders in those bureaucracies tend to align with someone like Prime Minister Yoon. Now, Yoon concluded within the last couple of years that he and his party were finished, that his party could not win a future election because the population, the electorate in Korea, is fed up with him, fed up with his behavior. One of the things that they all rebelled against was this notion of, well, there are North Koreans fighting for the Russians against Ukrainians. We should send troops to fight in Ukraine for NATO. Well, the Korean population said that's ridiculous. First of all, large numbers of them didn't believe it, that there are any North Koreans. As we know, there are no North Koreans fighting anybody in Ukraine. But the key thing is that they said, that's outrageous. We don't want it. And his position in the polls had sunk dramatically. So he said, the only way that I can keep Korea in the American orbit, firmly rooted as an American military colony, is if I stage a putsch and take over and become dictator of South Korea on the basis of erroneous emergencies, an imminent attack from the north and all this sort of business, none of which is true. It's failed because to the credit of the Korean people and their politicians, they got into the parliament and they voted unanimously to crush this. And his opposition has the majority in parliament anyway, but even much of his party voted with the opposition. So it was an overwhelming vote that said, stop this nonsense, end this business once and for all. So I think Yoon is probably going to be impeached. He may well end up in jail with some other people. I don't know what they'll do about the leaders in the intelligence and the military, but I'm sure there will be a reckoning with those people as well. The Koreans want national sovereignty. They want independence. They want to control the destiny of their people and their country. I fully support that, and I hope this works for them, because right now nobody in Washington wants this to happen.
Yeah, and in fact, that's exactly what I was going to say. I was stationed in Korea when I was a captain back in the late 1990s. And I remember then that there was talk that, we're working things out so that very soon we're going to shift, as you suggested, to a Korean head of the Combined Forces Command, the CFC it was called at the time. And it's like every year they say, well, they're getting closer, but nothing ever happened. So why does the United States, and this may be a rhetorical question, why does the United States oppose Koreans being in charge of the Korean military?
Why did the British want to retain permanent authority in India over the British Indian Army and the British Indian Foreign Service and Diplomatic Corps and government? Why do any of these powers do what they do? I think it's an acute case of national narcissism. It's the view that we keep justifying on the basis of an unchanging strategic environment, which you and I know is changing all the time. So they're pitching, oh, no. If you leave, there will be a war immediately in Northeast Asia. No, there won't. Nobody in Asia right now, nobody, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, nobody wants a war. The Vietnamese now have a hotline that goes from Ho Chi Minh City straight up to Beijing. And they've had plenty of disputes over fishing grounds, over oil resources, control of the South China Sea. They've sorted it out. It's not perfect, but they've sorted it out. And they agreed, we don't want to go to war. So they have this hotline. We are in the Philippines for the same reason. In fact, the Philippine government has said openly, we don't want to be goaded into war with China because of the United States. We want to justify our presence in Asia in perpetuity, our military presence. Notice I didn't say economic presence.
Yeah.
Again, everybody wants to do business with us. We should want to do business with everybody. And we're caught up in this cycle of what I would call bribery, bullying, and bombing. That's the way we do business. Either you do what we like or want, and you agree to our terms of trade, or, well, we'll bribe you if that doesn't work. We'll bully you, and if that doesn't work, we'll show up and bomb you. It's got to stop. It has no future in the 21st century. We got to stop living in the early 20th century. It's the only problem I have with all these people who talk about great power competition. Look, there's competition all over the world between various regional blocks. If anything, we're seeing regional blocks emerge. That competition is inevitable. It doesn't have to be armed.
Yeah.
And that's the point that we have to get through our heads. We're still set up for a world that doesn't exist anymore. That's why we continue to treat people that live in West Africa, North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Southwest Asia, Central Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, as though they're backward. No, these people aren't backward. Visit these places. Look at the infrastructure.
Exactly.
Look what they've created. Now, they may not all be what we think is appropriate in terms of pristine liberal democracies, but that's none of our business. What works is what we should respect, and we should respect the legitimacy of governments that have the power to maintain themselves. If the people don't like it, eventually that will change. We've seen that. The only exception, I think, is North Korea. That really is an exception to that rule. And those poor people are living permanently in a prison. I'd like to see them liberated, and I'm sure the South does as well. The only way to get there, though, is for us to get out.
Yeah.
We're in the way of that. And that helps North Korea to stay in existence. And everybody thinks China is behind it. It is not. Russia has always been North Korea's sponsor and backer, because from the time Stalin helped to create it after World War II, he saw it as a useful strategic hedge against the Japanese, as well as us. So we need to get out of there. And if they want to fight it out with the Japanese, let them go and do it. I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Because again, these are not irrational human beings. These people are intelligent, and they don't see any point to war. And I think that's what Putin, in his own way, has been trying to say over and over and over again. Listen to him. Well, if we go to nuclear weapons, we all die. And then he adds, but we in Russia will be martyrs. We'll go to heaven because we're martyrs. Okay, Vlad, I'm with you on that. He doesn't want to go. I don't want to go that way.
Yeah.
And we need to listen. What we don't listen. It's back to we don't listen. We don't listen to anybody.
Yeah. Because you said it really good that we never escaped the end of the Cold War. It's still 1992. in our minds, and we've never had anything behaved any differently, because this stuff worked in 1992. We could just do whatever we wanted, and then the world has grown up, and so much of the rest of the world that was neutral before is now turning against us, just because they see this ridiculous stuff coming out of our mouth. It's not tied to reality, and in fact, it's usually contradictory to reality. And eventually, Doug, I mean, historically, that does come with a price, and at some point, it gets paid whether we want it to or not.
It's always best to, as Queen Elizabeth II said in 1976, when we had our 200th anniversary, because I was there to listen to her. She said, "We learned from the American Revolution, it's better to gracefully release what you cannot forcibly retain." Well,
Wow.
that eventually happened. It should have happened closer to the end of World War I, but it happened after World War II. But ultimately, why? Britain was broke. It was financially ruined. And we're on that path now, I think.
Yeah. Well, time will tell on that, certainly, but all the signs are there. But anyway, but listen, really appreciate you as always, because you bring so many things to the table, so much historical analogies, and so much clarity on things that are really complicated, and we really appreciate it.
Okay, good, Dan. Thanks.
And thank you guys very much, too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't on your way out. And also let you know we are on podcast now. We have added that to it. Just go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere you get your podcast. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you'll find us waiting there for you. Thank you very much, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.